David Foster Wallace was a marketing genius because how he built himself up as this everyman Midwesterner who maybe is a writer but doesn't really know what's going on. And this was a conscientious decision. And today we are going to hear from Wallace about this decision and how he used it to his advantage as a writer. Because if you look at David Foster Wallace's childhood, his mother was a professor of English. His dad was a professor of philosophy. And from an early age, in the car on road trips, they'd be singing songs about linguistics, philosophy, grammar, and he was being drilled all the time on the various aspects of academics by his parents. And he never really had that stereotypical Midwestern childhood. And one of the things that can kind of show us this in his high school career is that he played tennis. And what are the two big sports in the Midwest? Well, of course, football, but also wrestling. I remember when I would wrestle against guys from the Midwest, they would just smack me because they had been doing it since 4 years old, and they would have mats in their basement and be going ham. But Wallace was not that guy. He was a stoner tennis player. Wallace started doing drugs and alcohol, I think, at 13 years old, and put that energy toward tennis and his weird academic predilections. And this kind of mirrors Helen Condenza's experience at the Enfield Tennis Academy in Infinite Jest. So if you guys don't already know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to David Foster Wallace here on YouTube. So go check out the playlist down below if you want more videos on Wallace. And now let us hear from Wallace on his Midwestern persona.
It's weird, and since I'm on a coast, this might be news to somebody. There is a kind of there's a Midwestern persona that's very useful to use, particularly in New York, which is just shy of the golly, the buildings are so tall thing, where I think people from the Midwest are expected to be not only non-hip, but several IQ points slower, and it can be extremely useful. People will reveal themselves to you in ways that they wouldn't to another East Coaster, and I think a lot of these were complex because not only was I dealing with topics that I didn't know all that well, but I was also doing them for magazines and East Coast magazines. I'm not used to being edited very closely. I was very anxious, and I think there's a certain amount of construction of the kind of, and it's somewhat of an ironic pose because I'm bright and I'm a good writer, and I'm not, so it's not like I'm, shaking the straw out of my hair as I'm going to these things, but there was this kind of extremely anxious, compulsive, agoraphobic person who, I guess part of it too is a lot of these, the danger of a lot of these seemed like they were set up to just sneer at stuff. The East Coast guy returns home and sneers at the state fair. The egghead goes on a cruise and sneers at the gross consumption, and that setting myself up as sort of vulnerable and neurotic and in-bent was a way to have at least a lot of the humor directed at myself rather than them. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was the thing I was most concerned. I didn't just want to do, literate spy magazine parodies of things.
So there are a couple different aspects to unpack here, but the one that screams out to me the most is Wallace was very careful about refining his character. And I think it was because of some early mistakes in his life and kind of his career that led him toward that. Because when you look at how he gives interviews, he's always self-correcting himself. He always makes sure he's kind of politically correct and apologizes for being white and all these different things. And it can be very annoying. But when I hear someone self-censoring and doing that, I can tell that they're trying to make, the audience view them in a certain way. And this is a conscious, deliberate attempt of creating a character. And it's coming from the mind of someone who is very good at creating characters. But it's kind of this big mishmash because he's not, Roman Reigns or The Rock up there on the microphone. Instead, he's kind of this fumbly dude who's a former addict and all these other things. And if we transport ourselves back to Wallace's early life, when he was at Amherst, apparently he was very cocky. He wasn't Midwestern Dave that he turns into later. He was the top dog at the university. Everyone knew him as this prodigal university philosophy student who was going to go on one day and become great. And he had that potential because he was one of a couple people. I think only 4 or 5 people per year get accepted into philosophy's PhD program for philosophy. And he was one of those people after not having taken a philosophy class for 4 or 5 years. So that shows you that he has, had a massive potential for philosophy. And so, okay, he kind of has this cocky attitude. And at the age of 22, he gets a $40,000 advance for the broom of the system, which, back in 1980, whatever, that's a lot of money. And so next he attends the University of Arizona, and he walks in there on day one, having gotten a bigger advance for a novel and made more more money from writing than any of his professors, probably all of his professors combined. And Wallace did not pull the Midwestern Dave there. By all available accounts, he was a dick there and was always arguing with the professor and was kind of unliked by his peers and his professors. Obviously because they weren't supporting his vision, but apparently he wasn't a very likable guy. So that's not this Midwestern persona. Where did it go? And I'm contending here that it never existed. But eventually, Wallace moves back to the East Coast after graduating from the University of Arizona. He gets accepted into Harvard's philosophy program, and only lasts two or three months, where once again he's being a dick. There's I don't remember the guy's name, but there was a famous philosophy professor he was taking a class with, and he'd be arguing with him just in the first couple weeks, saying this is all nonsensical. Who does that? That's a little bit unheard of, especially from Midwestern Dave. So he is spiraling so bad that eventually says he's going to kill himself or has a suicide attempt. I can't remember. And they put him. He eventually ends up in a halfway house, the Granada House, which emulates the halfway house in Infinite Jest. And in there, he can no longer be cocky Dave because he finally realized that his intellect, all these things that he had built up, his persona, weren't important. They don't help in recovery. That's kind of one of the big themes of Infinite Jest, that overthinking leads to addiction. And so what does David have to do? Well, the other problem is that everyone around him are like heroin addicts and people who don't care about any of his accolades. They don't know what he's talking about when he talks about Wittgenstein or Bret Easton Ellis or any of that. And so he has to kind of find a persona, find a character to connect to everyone with, and also slow himself down because now he's becoming sober and it's very hard for him to think. And I need to slow myself down right now and tell you guys about my free PDF on David Foster Wallace's favorite books. If you go down to the description below and click on that link, you will be able to get instant access to over 100 of David Foster Wallace's favorite books, his favorite books on writing, and the 3 books he always wrote with on his table beside him. And by probably the end of this week, I'm still trying to finish it, I'm going to send you an updated version with over 400 of Wallace's favorite books categorized into fiction, poetry, self-help, so on and so forth. And so this is a valuable resource that you will find nowhere else. And I'd love for you to have it to help you build up your book, list of books that you'll probably never read, but they look good on your shelf, or that's going to take you years to get to. That's where I'm at, but go check it out. And so he adopts this Midwestern persona. He adopts this, hey, I'm just this Midwestern guy. I don't really know what's going on, because he's dealing with Bostoners. I don't even know how they talk, but he's dealing with these addicts from Boston in this halfway house, working a security job, doing these crappy things, going to these AA meetings. And he can't be articulate Dave. And the other thing that he was uncovering during this time was all of his childhood trauma, how his mother and his father had wronged him, especially his mother. And the main critique, I'm sure, of her, of many things, was that she was too controlling, that she was, instilled too many of these academic pressures and was too crazy. So then he's unraveling all that and kind of realizing, okay, I don't really understand this monster I've created. So what does he revert to? And you see people do this all the time. He reverts back to high school. He reverts back to his early years and a lot of his friends and the people that were around him, because that's what he knows best. Because he was on such a trajectory with his mind and with his drug use that he never really necessarily absorbed the people around him. I've done this before. I've spent a lot of time around people, but I was so focused on myself or so inundated with substances that I didn't really get, the culture or let it change me as much as I should have. So the only thing I had, it was something earlier from childhood. And you see this with religious people all the time, or people coming back to religion. People, grew up religious and then they kind of go out into the world and they're like, when they're 16, 17, 18, 19, they smoke some weed and they're like, man, all this, religious stuff is BS. And they go off into the world, but they never actually individuate and do any real work. And so eventually they're 26, 27, and they're like, or older, and or have a family, and they're like, I feel empty inside. My life has no meaning, because with all this technology and all these things, it's impossible to find it now through a community or through life unless, once again, you've individuated. So what do? They return back to the original source. They return back to Christianity. And that's why we see this massive flock back to Christianity, because people are scared and have nothing else to tether to except the only kind of solid thing they had earlier in life. And Wallace did a very similar thing with his Midwestern roots. And in that, he actually found that it was easier because as he's talked about before, being someone who's smart and being smarter than everyone else is actually harder work than you think, because you're always arguing with people. If you have an opinion, for instance, if you have a diet, let's say you are a vegan or you follow like a carnivore diet, you when you tell people about it, people get offended. When someone's like, I have all these problems, you're like, why don't you change their diet? That's the last thing you can tell somebody. They're always very defensive about it. And this is about any aspect of life. You guys understand this. So you're a growth oriented person. And so Wallace understood that this was a much harder route. Like being smarter than everyone else, it sucks. And so he adopted this kind of persona. And a lot of us do this. I do this in my personal life. This is kind of where I get to let loose. But, I've been a yoga teacher for 12 years. I've been doing yoga for 14, 15 years. So I kind of take this more laid back, chill vibe and only, unleash knowledge when it's appropriate, if not at all. And that saves me a lot of stress. Anyway, so he starts implementing this in his typical life. And that's cool because it just helps him function easier in his AA meetings and being a professor and all of these different things. And it's kind of fueled even more because he gets a job at the University of Illinois and he moves back there and he kind of retaps into those roots, almost like I said earlier about something kind of going back to Christianity. So he really starts to learn it. As he returns, he gets to take all of his new prowess and mind and his sober state and be around students again, be around kids who are 18 to 22 years old, who are kind of this new generation of Midwesterners, and kind of absorb what they're into and really feel into it. And around this time, though, he's writing Infinite Jest, obviously, but he also starts to engage in nonfiction. And that's what he's talking about in this clip here, is that what's his perspective? Because Wallace could come, because what these papers, a lot of these newspapers and magazines who hired him, they're these East Coast magazines. And like he talked about, a lot of them were setups, like go campaign with John McCain and, do what Donald Trump did to him, like make these, look down upon John McCain, a former prisoner of war, or go talk crap about the Iowa State Fair, which is kind of this iconoclastic American symbol, or, cruises, which kind of a lot of middle class to lower middle class white Americans go on. And they kind of send Wallace out there, who's kind of this ringer who has this big mind and can dissect it. But he doesn't take kind of that deconstructionist mindset. He doesn't necessarily bring irony on there. He's really embodying most of the time kind of these phenomenological elements and combining it with maximalism, just being there in the moment. But the lens that he's framing all of this through is that he's just this Midwesterner, this kind of smart, Midwesterner who has some intellect, but he's just kind of shocked at what's going on, like, and it works really well. And I think that's really why his nonfiction is great, because he subverts the purpose of the article. He goes there, and there are times when he's shocked, but he doesn't necessarily commentate on these things and do what a lot of news organizations do now. When you look at all the hit pieces in the Rolling Stone and Politico or all these other places, when they kind of look at these more right-centered groups or events or symbols, most of the time it's this big teardown, and they associate it with white supremacy and with all these other things, instead of just kind of viewing it what it is and what 90% of or plus percent of what people there are there for, and like kind of their mindset. But this was a conscientious decision. Wallace felt that this was the right idea, because how is he going to present himself to the world? After Infinite Jest gets published, what is he going to do? Well, he's this random unknown professor who published some stuff, but he's from Illinois. He already had that, but that really wasn't him. At least that hadn't been him since he was 12 or 13 years old. And so I think that was a genius decision, because it helped build mystique more and helped it grow, helped it seem more accessible, and he would draw people in with that. And then they'd be shocked at his writing style. Imagine hearing David Foster Wallace, or even reading some of his easier nonfiction pieces, and then reading a supposedly fun thing I'd never do again, or Infinite Jest, or The Pale King, or some of his earlier stuff. You're like, holy hell. And then you get both sides. You get to be with this relatable guy, relatable Wallace, and then crazy Wallace. It's the ultimate contrast. And that, at some level, is very important in creating a likable character. He is liked by the middle class. He's liked by all the people. But then he also kind of has these deeper hidden elements that other people can dive into. He's accessible to everybody. And it's a genius move, because most of his writing is inaccessible. That's why he's considered one of the most unfinished authors of all time, because people want to like him. They want to read him. I see that in my comments all the time. People just can't finish his work. But you guys like these videos. People love to hear me talk about him and hear his viewpoints on things, but they don't like his writing. That's a pretty damn good place to be. That means that you are famous, but are also loved by the Lit Bros. And that's why I think Wallace is going to go down and continue to be a big topic in history and have people continue to get into him and love him because they saw this potential. They saw this Midwestern side of him. And it's funny, it all just started out as a coping mechanism against the crazy East Coasters. Hey, I'm from South Philly. I'm from South Boston. Yeah. And so what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think that Wallace made this conscious character, that he formed this, that this was almost pre-planned, especially after, or was it just a defensive mechanism that he eventually just picked up with and just kind of ran with it? And it maybe just, circumstantially happened. He had to use it defensively in Boston, and then he got, just by chance, an offer for a teaching position in the Midwest, and boom, there we have it. Then the perfect storm. I don't think people who are this smart usually get overtaken like that, though, but I could be wrong.